On the afternoon of January 7th, 1961, at approximately 2:45 p.m., Special Branch officers stood in the front bedroom of a modest, semi-detached bungalow at 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip, a quiet suburb in northwest London, examining what appeared to be an ordinary Johnson's baby powder tin. The tin was made of white metal with pale pink lettering, approximately 4 inches tall and 3 inches in diameter, the kind of container that could be found in thousands of British bathrooms. Officers had opened dozens of similar containers during the search of the property that had begun 3 hours earlier. Most had contained exactly what they appeared to contain: talcum powder, face cream, aspirin tablets, ordinary household items. This one was different. The weight was wrong. One of the officers, a veteran of counterintelligence searches with 19 years of experience since the end of World War II, had developed what colleagues described as an instinct for things that appeared normal but were not. The talcum powder tin felt too heavy for its size. When he shook it gently, the contents did not shift with the characteristic whisper of powder against metal. Instead, there was a muffled solidity that suggested something denser inside. The officer carefully pried open the tin's lid. Inside, as he had suspected, there was talcum powder, but only a thin layer, perhaps half an inch deep, covering the top of the container. He used a small tool to probe beneath the powder. His fingers encountered something hard and flat. Working carefully, he lifted out a false bottom constructed from thin metal, painted white on the upper surface to match the tin's interior. Beneath this false bottom was a cavity containing 2 items that would prove to be among the most significant pieces of physical evidence ever recovered from a Soviet espionage operation on British soil. The first item was a microdot reader, a small optical device approximately 2 inches long designed to magnify microdots to readable size. Microdots were photographs of documents reduced to the size of a typewritten period, allowing entire pages of text to be hidden in seemingly innocent letters or objects. The second item was a length of 35mm microfilm containing what would later be identified as classified technical specifications related to Britain's nuclear submarine program. The officer carefully set the tin and its contents aside and turned to address the other officers searching the bedroom. According to later reports, the discovery was immediately recognized as significant. For nearly 8 years, British intelligence had been attempting to identify and neutralize a Soviet espionage network operating inside Britain's most sensitive defense facilities. The talcum powder tin and its contents represented confirmation that they had been right, that the investigation had been justified, and that the individuals they had arrested 3 hours earlier were not, as they had claimed, innocent victims of a misunderstanding. Before we continue with how this single household object unraveled an 8-year Soviet operation and destroyed multiple lives, if you're fascinated by the real documented cases of Cold War espionage and the actual techniques intelligence services used on both sides of the Iron Curtain, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these carefully researched historical cases every week, drawing exclusively from declassified files, trial records, and verified sources to separate documented fact from Cold War mythology. Now, let's go back to 1960, when British intelligence first learned that something was catastrophically wrong at a Royal Navy facility on the southern coast of England. The bungalow at 45 Cranley Drive belonged to Peter John Kroger and his wife, Helen Kroger. The couple, both in their late 40s, had lived at the address since 1955. According to their account to neighbors and local authorities, they were antiquarian booksellers who had emigrated from New York to England seeking new business opportunities. Peter Kroger, whose accent retained clear American inflections despite 6 years in Britain, was described by neighbors as friendly and gregarious, though somewhat private about his personal affairs. Helen was quieter, more reserved, but pleasant when encountered at local shops or neighborhood gatherings. They owned a small white standard motor car and took occasional trips to the countryside. They attended local social events irregularly and had no close friends in the area, though they maintained cordial relationships with their immediate neighbors. The truth, which MI5 had begun to suspect by 1960, and which the search of 45 Cranley Drive would definitively confirm, was that Peter and Helen Kroger were not antiquarian booksellers from New York. Their real names were Morris Cohen and Lona Cohen. They were American-born Soviet intelligence officers who had worked in atomic espionage in the United States during the 1940s. They had fled the United States in 1950 after the arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and the beginning of investigations that threatened to expose the entire network. The Soviet Intelligence Service, then called the MGB and later reorganized as the KGB, had provided them with false identities and relocated them to Britain, where they had been serving as illegal residents, deep-cover intelligence officers operating without diplomatic protection, coordinating a network that was stealing some of Britain's most closely guarded military secrets. The story of how British intelligence discovered the Portland spy ring began not in Britain, but in divided Cold War Berlin, where intelligence officers from both sides conducted a shadowy war of recruitment, defection, and betrayal. In 1958, a Polish intelligence officer named Michał Goleniewski, who held the rank of deputy chief in Polish military counterintelligence, made a decision that would ultimately expose Soviet espionage networks across Western Europe and North America. Goleniewski began secretly passing information to the CIA through a series of anonymous letters sent to the American embassy in Bern, Switzerland. Goleniewski's position gave him access to intelligence shared among Warsaw Pact services, including details about Soviet KGB operations in Western countries. The information he provided was fragmentary at first. Code names, hints about the locations of Soviet networks, partial biographical details about agents and their handlers. The CIA assessed the information carefully, attempting to verify what could be verified and to determine whether Goleniewski was genuine or whether this might be a Soviet deception operation designed to feed false information to Western intelligence. By late 1959 or early 1960, Goleniewski had provided information indicating that Soviet intelligence was running an active espionage operation inside a British naval facility. The information was not complete. Goleniewski did not know the specific location or the full identities of those involved, but it included enough detail to alert British intelligence that there was a serious compromise somewhere in the naval establishment. The CIA shared this information with MI5, Britain's domestic security service, in early 1960. MI5 began a careful process of attempting to identify which naval facility had been compromised and who might be involved. The information from Goleniewski suggested the facility was on the southern coast and was involved in submarine-related research. This pointed toward the Royal Navy installation at Portland in Dorset, southwest England. The Portland Naval Base was home to the Underwater Detection Establishment, a classified research facility where scientists and engineers developed sonar systems and other technologies for Britain's submarine fleet, including the new nuclear-powered submarines that represented one of Britain's most important strategic assets during the Cold War. MI5's investigation focused on personnel at the Underwater Detection Establishment who had access to classified materials and who might be vulnerable to Soviet recruitment. The investigation was conducted with extreme discretion. If the Soviets learned that British intelligence was searching for a penetration, the compromised individual might cease activities, destroy evidence, or flee, making identification and prosecution impossible. By mid-1960, MI5 investigators had identified a potential suspect, Harry Frederick Houghton, a 46-year-old clerk who worked in the establishment's test equipment section. Houghton had served in the Royal Navy during World War II and had joined the civil service afterward. He had been working at the underwater detection establishment since 1951. Personnel records showed concerning indicators in his background. During a previous posting in Warsaw, where he had worked as an assistant to the British naval attaché in the late 1940s, Houghton had struggled with alcohol consumption and had been involved in black market activities. He had been recalled from Warsaw in 1952 following complaints about his conduct and had been transferred to the Portland facility. Despite these concerns in his background, Houghton had retained his security clearance and his access to classified information. This represented a failure in the security vetting process. Someone with Houghton's demonstrated vulnerabilities should have been subject to enhanced scrutiny or should have had his access to sensitive materials restricted. But in the security culture of the 1950s, once someone received a clearance, they were generally trusted unless specific new concerns emerged. MI5. Surveillance of Houghton began in the summer of 1960. Agents documented his daily routines, his movements on weekends, and any individuals he met with outside of work. For the first several weeks, the surveillance produced little of obvious significance. Houghton drove to work each morning, spent the day at the underwater detection establishment, and returned home each evening to the small flat he rented in Weymouth. He visited pubs on Friday and Saturday evenings. He occasionally took day trips in his car along the Dorset coast. But surveillance also revealed that Houghton appeared to have more money than his civil service salary would explain. He had recently purchased a new car. He took weekend trips that seemed expensive for someone in his income bracket. He gambled regularly and appeared to lose substantial sums without financial distress. These indicators suggested an additional source of income beyond his government salary. On the first Saturday of July 1960, Houghton's routine changed in a way that immediately caught the attention of MI5 surveillance teams. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, he drove from his flat in Weymouth not toward the coast or to any of his usual weekend destinations, but north toward London. I-5 agents followed at a distance, maintaining what surveillance specialists called a loose tail to avoid detection. Houghton drove for approximately 2.5 hours, entering London from the southwest and making his way toward the city centre. Shortly after midday, Houghton parked his car on a side street near Waterloo station in central London. He walked to a busy area near the station where multiple streets intersected and pedestrian traffic was substantial, exactly the kind of location that would be chosen for a clandestine meeting because surveillance would be difficult to maintain without being detected and because both parties could easily blend into crowds before and after the encounter. Houghton waited at the corner for several minutes, appearing to anyone watching to be simply waiting for someone, perhaps a friend or business acquaintance. MI5 agents positioned in nearby locations photographed him from multiple angles using cameras concealed in briefcases and shopping bags. Shortly after Houghton arrived, a man approached from the direction of Waterloo station. The two men greeted each other with a handshake that suggested familiarity rather than a first meeting. They spoke briefly, the conversation lasted no more than a minute or two, and then Houghton handed the man a large envelope. The man placed the envelope inside the raincoat he was carrying. They exchanged a few more words, and then the man walked away, heading back toward Waterloo station. MI5 agents following the unknown man documented his route through the station and onto a train heading northwest out of London. They followed him to the suburb of Ruislip, where he walked from the station to 45 Cranley Drive, entering the bungalow using a key. Property records identified the residents as Peter and Helen Kroger. The agents photographed the man entering the property and noted the time. Over the following months, from July through December 1960, MI5 conducted comprehensive surveillance of both Harry Houghton and the Krogers. A pattern emerged that was consistent and unmistakable. On the first Saturday of each month, Houghton would drive to London and meet with either the man who had entered the Kroger residence, whom MI5 would later identify as Peter Kroger himself, or less frequently with a different man whom agents would eventually identify as Gordon Arnold Lonsdale, a 38-year-old businessman who operated a company selling jukeboxes and bubble-gum machines to pubs and restaurants across southern England. The meetings always followed similar procedures that reflected professional intelligence tradecraft. They occurred in public locations with substantial pedestrian traffic, busy street corners, the area outside Waterloo station, locations where two people meeting would not seem unusual or memorable. The meetings were brief, lasting only a few minutes, minimizing the time during which surveillance might be detected. Houghton would hand over an envelope or package. The person he was meeting would sometimes hand him something in return, usually a smaller envelope. After the exchange, both parties would depart separately, often walking in opposite directions or taking different transportation routes. The regularity of the schedule, first Saturday of each month, provided predictable opportunities for information transfer while limiting exposure. I-5's investigation expanded to include comprehensive surveillance and background checks on all three individuals who appeared to be involved in the network: Harry Houghton, Gordon Lonsdale, and Peter and Helen Kroger. What they discovered suggested an espionage operation of significant sophistication and long duration. Gordon Arnold Lonsdale presented himself as a Canadian citizen who had been born in Toronto in 1924 and had moved to Britain in 1955 to pursue business opportunities. He lived in a flat on the White House, Albany Street, near Regent's Park in central London. He drove an American car, a two-tone Studebaker, which was unusual enough in Britain to be memorable. He was socially active, dating various women, dining at restaurants, attending theaters and nightclubs. His business, which involved installing and servicing coin-operated machines, appeared to be moderately successful and provided plausible cover for regular travel throughout England. MI5's background investigation of Lonsdale revealed inconsistencies in his claimed history. The Canadian birth certificate he had used to obtain his passport showed a Gordon Arnold Lonsdale born in Toronto in 1924, but further investigation by Canadian authorities revealed that this individual had died in infancy in 1925. Someone had assumed the identity of the deceased child, a common technique in creating false identities known as legend building, and had constructed an elaborate cover story supported by documents and fabricated biographical details that would allow a Soviet intelligence officer to operate under deep cover in the West. Further investigation, including consultation with intelligence from Soviet defectors and comparison of Lonsdale's photograph with files maintained by Western intelligence services, eventually led MI5 to conclude that Gordon Lonsdale was actually Konon Trofimovich Molody, a Soviet citizen who had been recruited into Soviet intelligence in the late 1930s. According to intelligence assessments, Molody had spent time in California during World War II, where his family had briefly lived, establishing his English language skills and absorbing Western mannerisms that would make his later cover identity convincing. He had been infiltrated into Canada in the early 1950s using the Lonsdale identity, had established himself there, and had then moved to Britain around 1955. He was assessed to be a KGB illegal resident, a deep-cover intelligence officer operating without diplomatic protection, responsible for coordinating espionage operations and managing networks of assets. Peter and Helen Kroger's background similarly contained anomalies that suggested false identities. The couple claimed to have emigrated from New York in 1955, but efforts to verify their history in the United States produced contradictory information. The address they had provided as their previous residence in New York did not match property or business records from that period. Their claimed history as antiquarian booksellers could not be confirmed through trade associations or business registries that would normally document such activities. The business contacts they mentioned either did not exist or had no memory of dealing with anyone named Kroger. MI5 obtained samples of the Krogers' fingerprints through covert means, items they had handled at social events, glasses they had used at restaurants, and sent these prints to the FBI in Washington for comparison against American criminal and intelligence files. In October 1960, the FBI confirmed that the fingerprints matched Morris Cohen and Lona Cohen, American citizens who had been identified as Soviet intelligence operatives during investigations into atomic espionage in the late 1940s and who had disappeared in 1950 when the investigation into the Rosenberg spy ring had intensified. Morris Cohen, born in 1910 in New York to Russian immigrant parents, had been recruited into Soviet intelligence in the 1930s through his association with Communist Party activities in the United States. During World War II, he had served in the United States Army and had been trained in radio operations and communications, skills that would later prove valuable in his intelligence work. After the war, he and his wife Lona, whom he had married in 1941, had become part of the Soviet espionage network in the United States that was collecting information on the Manhattan Project and other sensitive military programs. They had worked in supporting roles, helping to coordinate communications and document transfers for other operatives, including Klaus Fuchs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and David Greenglass. When the network began to collapse in 1950, following the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in Britain and the subsequent investigation that led to the Rosenbergs in the United States, the Cohens had fled. Soviet intelligence had extracted them, provided them with new identities as Peter and Helen Kroger, and relocated them first to the Soviet Union for several years of additional training and preparation, and then to Britain to establish themselves and eventually support Soviet intelligence operations there. By December 1960, Hanoi 5 had assembled a comprehensive picture of the Portland spy ring's structure and operation. Harry Houghton was the source. He had access to classified information at the underwater detection establishment and was removing documents and technical specifications, photographing them or making copies, and passing the material to his Soviet handlers. Gordon Lonsdale was the principal case officer. He managed Houghton as an asset, received the information Houghton provided, and coordinated its transmission to Moscow. Peter and Helen Kroger served as support operatives. Their bungalow in Ruislip functioned as a communications center and safe house where information received from Houghton could be processed, reduced to microfilm or microdots, and transmitted to Soviet intelligence headquarters via radio. What remained unclear was the full extent of the information that had been compromised and how long the operation had been running. MI5 needed to determine what specific documents Houghton had accessed, what he had passed to Lonsdale, and what damage had been done to Britain's national security. To answer these questions without alerting the suspects that they were under investigation, MI5 took the risky step of conducting a covert search of Houghton's flat in Weymouth while he was at work. The search, conducted in early January 1961 by a team of specially trained officers, revealed a cache of classified documents hidden in various locations throughout the flat. Documents were found inside a hollowed-out book on a shelf, beneath loosened floorboards in the bedroom, in the back of a closet behind boxes of personal items. The documents included technical specifications for sonar systems, operational procedures for submarine detection equipment, and reports on the performance characteristics of Britain's nuclear submarine fleet. Many of the documents bore classification markings: confidential, secret, and in some cases, top secret. The material represented a comprehensive compromise of some of Britain's most sensitive naval technologies. Also discovered during the search was evidence of Houghton's relationship with another employee at the underwater detection establishment, Ethel Elizabeth G., a 46-year-old clerk known to colleagues as Bunty. Letters and photographs found in Houghton's flat indicated a romantic relationship. More significantly, some of the classified documents found in Houghton's possession had come from sections of the underwater detection establishment where G., not Houghton, worked. This suggested that G. was not merely Houghton's girlfriend, but was actively involved in obtaining classified materials for him. The decision was made to proceed with arrests. The timing was carefully chosen to maximize the chances of catching all participants with evidence in their possession while preventing any of them from warning the others or destroying materials. The plan was to arrest Houghton and whoever he met with during his next scheduled meeting in early January, then immediately move on the Kroger bungalow in Ruislip before they could be alerted that the network had been compromised. On Saturday, January 7, 1961, MI5 surveillance teams took up positions around Waterloo Station and the surrounding streets before dawn. Harry Houghton was observed leaving his flat in Weymouth at approximately 8:15 in the morning and beginning the drive toward London. I-5 teams followed his route, maintaining visual contact while staying far enough back to avoid detection. Houghton arrived in London late in the morning and parked in a location he had used for previous meetings near Waterloo. Also under surveillance that morning was Gordon Lonsdale, who left his flat on Albany Street mid-morning and drove his distinctive Studebaker toward Waterloo Station. What MI5 had not anticipated was that Houghton would not be alone. Walking beside him as he approached the meeting location was Ethel G. Her presence at the meeting confirmed that she was not merely Houghton's girlfriend, but an active participant in the espionage operation. Around midday, Houghton and G. met Lonsdale near the Old Vic Theatre, at a location they had used for previous exchanges. MI5 agents watching from multiple positions saw Houghton hand Lonsdale a shopping bag. Lonsdale took the bag and handed Houghton an envelope in return. At that moment, special branch officers who had been positioned nearby moved in from different directions, surrounding the three individuals before any of them could react or flee. The arrest was conducted quickly and professionally. Houghton, G., and Lonsdale were taken into custody and transported to separate locations for interrogation. The shopping bag Houghton had given to Lonsdale was opened and found to contain 4 Admiralty test pamphlets classified as confidential, technical drawings related to submarine detection equipment, and documents reporting on recent operational exercises. The envelope Lonsdale had given to Houghton contained £125 in cash, payment for the information provided. Simultaneously with the arrests at Waterloo, additional special branch officers proceeded to 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip. Peter and Helen Kroger were at home when officers knocked on the door shortly after the Waterloo arrests. According to arrest reports, Helen Kroger answered the door and appeared shocked when officers identified themselves and presented a search warrant. Peter Kroger was in the living room. Both were placed under arrest and cautioned under British law. Helen Kroger asked if she could tend to a pot on the stove in the kitchen, claiming she had been cooking when the officers arrived. An officer accompanied her to the kitchen, where she attempted to reach for her handbag on the counter. When the officer prevented her from doing so, she became agitated and had to be physically restrained. The handbag was later found to contain a 6-page letter written in Russian, apparently ready to be sent to a Soviet contact. Her attempt to destroy this letter before it could be discovered was an admission through action of consciousness of guilt. The search of 45 Cranley Drive began in the early afternoon and continued for more than 7 hours. The bungalow appeared at first examination to be an ordinary middle-class residence. The living room contained comfortable furniture, bookshelves filled with antiquarian books that seemed consistent with the Krogers' claimed profession, and personal items that suggested a settled domestic life. The kitchen was well equipped but unremarkable. The bedroom contained a double bed, wardrobes, and dressing tables. Nothing about the visible appearance of the residence immediately suggested espionage activities, but as the search progressed systematically through each room, investigators began to find items that seemed inconsistent with the Krogers' lifestyle as modestly successful antiquarian booksellers. In a drawer in the bedroom, officers found £5,000 in cash, a substantial sum in 1961, equivalent to several years' income for an average British worker. Such a large cash hoard had no innocent explanation for a couple supposedly running a small book business. In another drawer, they found a collection of passports and identity documents for various individuals, including passports in the names of Peter and Helen Kroger, but showing different photographs than the current occupants of the residence. It was the discovery of the talcum powder tin, with its hidden compartment containing the microdot reader and microfilm, that transformed the search into a hunt for additional espionage equipment. The search team began examining every item in the bungalow with heightened attention, looking for anything that might contain hidden compartments or serve purposes other than their apparent function. In the bathroom, investigators found additional cosmetic containers with false bottoms similar to the talcum powder tin. One face cream jar contained not face cream, but a cipher pad, a one-time pad used for encoding and decoding messages consisting of pages of random number groups that would be used once and then destroyed, making the code theoretically unbreakable if used correctly. Another container held additional microfilm showing photographs of classified documents. In the kitchen, investigators made an even more significant discovery. Beneath the kitchen floor, hidden under what appeared to be a fixed section of linoleum and floorboards that had been carefully cut and fitted so the seam was nearly invisible, was a cavity approximately 2 feet square and 8 inches deep. Inside this cavity was a sophisticated radio transmitter and receiver capable of sending and receiving high-frequency signals over thousands of miles. The equipment was of Soviet manufacture, built to military specifications, and included components that would have been difficult or impossible for civilians to obtain through commercial channels in Britain. Also found in the cavity beneath the kitchen floor were additional cipher pads, spare parts for the radio equipment including replacement tubes and crystals, and several notebooks containing what appeared to be transmission schedules, specific times and radio frequencies for communications with Moscow. The schedules showed that the Krogers had been maintaining regular contact with Soviet intelligence, transmitting messages on predetermined frequencies at predetermined times when Soviet receiving stations would be listening. In Peter Kroger's workshop area in the garage, investigators found camera equipment suitable for photographing documents, including copy stands that would hold documents flat, specialized lighting designed to eliminate shadows and glare, and high-resolution film capable of capturing fine details of technical drawings. They also found developing equipment and chemicals for processing film and creating microdots, the tiny photographic reproductions of documents that could be hidden in ordinary correspondence or concealed in objects like the talcum powder tin. The search of 45 Cranley Drive ultimately produced more than 300 pieces of evidence. The inventory included the microdot reader from the talcum powder tin, 7 radio receiver and transmitter sets or components, multiple cipher pads and code materials, false identity documents for several different identities, large sums of cash in British pounds and various other currencies, microfilm containing photographs of classified documents, cameras, and photographic equipment, and a typewriter that used Cyrillic characters, the Russian alphabet, rather than the Latin alphabet used for English. The interrogations of the 5 arrested individuals began within hours of their arrests and continued for several weeks. The approaches to interrogation differed based on what investigators believed each person knew and what they hoped to learn. Harry Houghton was interrogated at a secure facility in London. According to interrogation logs that were later summarized in court proceedings, he initially attempted to deny any wrongdoing, claiming that he had been meeting with Lonsdale to discuss potential business opportunities and that any documents found in his possession had been removed from the underwater detection establishment by accident or for legitimate work purposes. This story was implausible on its face and collapsed completely when confronted with the surveillance evidence, including photographs documenting multiple meetings with Lonsdale over a 6-month period, the classified documents found hidden in his flat, and Lonsdale's possession of classified material at the time of arrest. By the 3rd day of interrogation, Houghton abandoned his denials and began to provide information about his activities. According to his statement, his recruitment by Soviet intelligence had occurred in the early 1950s, not long after his transfer to the Portland facility following his recall from Warsaw. He claimed he had been approached by someone he knew only by a first name, who had suggested that Houghton might be willing to provide information about his work in exchange for money. Houghton, who had accumulated debts due to drinking and gambling and was struggling financially, had agreed to the arrangement. Over the following years, Houghton had provided classified documents and technical information on a regular basis, receiving payment for each delivery. In the mid-1950s, his original handler had introduced him to Gordon Lonsdale, who had taken over as his primary contact. The monthly meeting schedule had been established, and Houghton had continued providing information for approximately 6 years until his arrest. He estimated that he had been paid a total of several £1,000s over that period. When asked what specific information he had provided, Houghton initially attempted to minimize the significance of the material, claiming he had only given his handlers routine reports and unimportant technical specifications. However, when presented with the classified documents found in his flat and in the shopping bag he had given to Lonsdale at the time of his arrest, he was forced to acknowledge that the material was in fact highly sensitive and that he had understood it was classified and should not have been removed from the underwater detection establishment. Ethel G's interrogation followed a similar pattern. She initially denied any knowledge of espionage, claiming she had been at Waterloo that day simply to accompany Houghton on a trip to London and had no idea what he was doing or whom he was meeting. This claim was impossible to sustain given the evidence. The classified documents Houghton had given to Lonsdale had come from sections of the underwater detection establishment where G, not Houghton, worked, and which Houghton would have had no legitimate reason to access. Further interrogation revealed that G had been actively involved in obtaining classified materials for Houghton. According to her eventual statement, she had become involved in the espionage operation in 1958, approximately 3 years before her arrest. Houghton, with whom she was in a romantic relationship, had recruited her by suggesting that she help him occasionally obtain certain documents. G, who described herself as having been infatuated with Houghton, had agreed to help. Over the following 3 years, she had removed hundreds of classified documents from her work area, provided them to Houghton, who photographed them, and then returned them to their proper files before they were missed. When asked about her motivations, G struggled to articulate a clear explanation. She said she had helped Houghton because she loved him and wanted to please him. She claimed she had not fully understood that what they were doing constituted espionage, or that the information was being provided to a foreign power. This profession of ignorance was difficult to reconcile with the evidence and with the systematic nature of her participation over 3 years, but interrogators assessed that G had indeed operated under willful blindness, choosing not to ask questions about what Houghton was doing with the documents because she did not want to confront the implications. Gordon Lonsdale's interrogation proved far more difficult. Unlike Houghton and G, who were British civil servants with no espionage training who eventually provided information under interrogation pressure, Lonsdale was a professional intelligence officer who had been trained to resist interrogation. He maintained his cover story that he was Gordon Lonsdale, a Canadian businessman, and claimed that any meetings with Houghton had been innocent business discussions. When confronted with the classified documents found in his possession at the time of arrest, he claimed Houghton had given him the shopping bag without explaining what it contained and that he had been unaware of the contents until officers opened the bag after his arrest. This story was manifestly false. No reasonable person would accept a shopping bag from someone without knowing what was in it, and the cash payment to Houghton made the claim of innocent business discussion absurd. But Lonsdale maintained this story consistently through weeks of interrogation. He refused to acknowledge his true identity as Conan Malady, refused to admit he was a Soviet intelligence officer, and refused to provide any information about his activities, his contacts beyond those already known, or his operations. Interrogators eventually concluded that Lonsdale would not cooperate and that prosecution would have to proceed based on the physical evidence and the testimony of Houghton and G, rather than on any confession from Lonsdale. Peter and Helen Kroger adopted the same approach as Lonsdale, maintaining their cover story despite the overwhelming evidence found in their bungalow. When confronted with the false identity documents, the large cache of currency, the radio equipment, the cipher pads, and the microdot reader found in the talcum powder tin, Peter Kroger claimed he had no knowledge of how these items came to be in his residence, and suggested they must have been planted by British intelligence to frame innocent people. Helen Kroger similarly denied all involvement, maintaining that she was a housewife who knew nothing about espionage or Soviet intelligence operations. When confronted with her attempted destruction of the Russian-language letter found in her handbag at the time of arrest, she claimed the letter was a personal document and that her attempt to reach for her handbag had been innocent. Neither Peter nor Helen Kroger ever acknowledged their true identities as Morris and Lona Cohen, or admitted their roles as Soviet intelligence operatives. Despite the fingerprint evidence that definitively confirmed their real identities and the extensive documentation of their espionage support activities found during the search of their residence, the 5 defendants were charged in February 1961 with multiple offenses under the Official Secrets Act of 1911 and 1920. The charges included conspiracy to commit espionage, unauthorized communication of information useful to an enemy, and possession of documents and articles for purposes prejudicial to the safety and interests of the state. The trial was scheduled to begin in March 1961 at the Central Criminal Court, known as the Old Bailey, in London. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Reginald Manningham Buller, reflecting the seriousness with which the British government viewed the case. The decision to have the Attorney General personally lead the prosecution, rather than delegating to other prosecutors, signaled to the court and to the public that this was a matter of the highest national importance. The evidence presented during the trial included detailed testimony from MI5 agents who had conducted the surveillance operation, special branch officers who had executed the arrests and searches, Technical experts who analyzed the espionage equipment found at the Kroger residence, and Admiralty officials who assessed the damage caused by the compromise of classified information. The surveillance photographs were particularly compelling evidence for the jury. They were shown images documenting Houghton meeting with Lonsdale near Waterloo Station on multiple occasions, handing over packages, and receiving envelopes in return. The photographs showed the pattern of monthly meetings over a 6-month period from July through December 1960. They saw images of Lonsdale entering the Kroger bungalow immediately after meetings with Houghton, establishing the connection between Houghton's information collection and the Kroger communications operation. The physical evidence from the search of 45 Cranley Drive was displayed in the courtroom, allowing the jury to see firsthand the sophisticated espionage equipment that had been concealed in an ordinary suburban home. The radio transmitter that had been hidden beneath the kitchen floor was shown, along with expert testimony explaining its capabilities for long-distance communication with Moscow. The cipher pads were displayed and explained. The microdot reader from the talcum powder tin was shown to the jury, along with demonstrations of how microdots could be used to hide entire pages of documents in tiny photographs invisible to the naked eye. The microfilm showing photographed classified documents was presented as evidence of what the network had been stealing and transmitting. The classified documents themselves were presented in a closed session, with the public and press excluded from the courtroom to protect information that remained sensitive. Admiralty officials testified in this closed session that the information compromised by Houghton and G included detailed technical specifications for Britain's newest submarine detection systems, operational procedures that could allow adversaries to understand Britain's naval capabilities and develop effective countermeasures, and strategic information about the deployment patterns and capabilities of Britain's nuclear submarine fleet. The damage assessment prepared by the Admiralty and the Ministry of Defense concluded that the espionage had significantly compromised Britain's national security in the maritime domain and had provided the Soviet Union with substantial advantages in understanding and potentially neutralizing Britain's submarine warfare capabilities. The defense attorneys faced an essentially impossible task given the weight of evidence against all 5 defendants. The evidence included extensive surveillance documentation, physical evidence of espionage equipment and classified materials, and, in the cases of Houghton and G, their own confessions during interrogation. The defense strategy focused not on contesting guilt, which would have been futile, but on attempting to minimize sentences by emphasizing factors such as the defendant's cooperation with authorities, lack of previous criminal records, and in the cases of Houghton and G, their supposedly limited understanding of the full implications of their actions. Lonsdale's attorney argued that while the evidence showed his client had been in contact with Houghton and had received documents from him, the prosecution had not definitively proven that Lonsdale had known the documents were classified or that he had intended to transmit them to a foreign power. This argument was undermined by multiple factors: Lonsdale's use of false identity and professional surveillance-resistant tradecraft, the pattern of regular monthly meetings over years, and the cash payments to Houghton. These factors were all consistent with professional intelligence operations and inconsistent with any innocent explanation. The Kroger's attorneys argued that the espionage equipment found in their bungalow could have been placed there without their knowledge, perhaps by Lonsdale or by other Soviet intelligence operatives using their home as an operational facility without the Kroger's awareness or consent. This argument was similarly undermined by the evidence. The equipment had been found in purpose-built hiding places throughout the residence: the false-bottom talcum powder tin, the cavity beneath the kitchen floor with its carefully constructed concealment, the hollowed-out containers in the bathroom. These hiding places had required construction and would have been impossible to install without the residents' knowledge. Additionally, the cipher pads and transmission schedules found in the Kroger's personal possessions and Helen Kroger's attempt to destroy the Russian-language letter at the time of arrest both indicated knowing participation rather than innocent victimization. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, as the prosecution methodically presented its evidence and the defense attempted to create doubt where none reasonably existed. On March 22, 1961, after deliberating for approximately 3 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts for all 5 defendants on all charges. The verdict was unanimous. Sentencing was scheduled for the following day. On March 23, 1961, Mr. Justice Parker, presiding over the trial, delivered sentencing remarks that emphasized the gravity of the offenses and the damage the defendants' espionage had caused to Britain's national security. He noted that Lonsdale and the Krogers appeared to be professional intelligence officers who had betrayed the hospitality extended to them by Britain by conducting espionage operations on British soil against British interests. He noted that Houghton and G had betrayed positions of trust, had violated their oaths to protect classified information entrusted to them, and had provided sensitive military secrets to a hostile foreign power in exchange for personal financial gain. The sentences handed down reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Gordon Lonsdale was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. Peter Kroger was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Helen Kroger was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Harry Houghton was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Ethel G. was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. These sentences were among the longest ever imposed in British espionage cases up to that time and reflected the court's view that the Portland spy ring represented one of the most serious compromises of British national security since World War II. The 5 convicted spies were incarcerated in separate facilities across Britain. Lonsdale was sent to Wormwood Scrubbs Prison in West London. Peter Kroger was sent to Strangeways Prison in Manchester. Helen Kroger was sent to Holloway Prison, the primary women's prison in North London. Houghton was sent to Winchester Prison in Hampshire. G was sent to Ascombe Grange Open Prison in Yorkshire. The impact of their espionage and the subsequent investigation, trial, and imprisonment extended far beyond the 5 individuals who had been convicted. The case triggered a comprehensive security review of Britain's defense establishments, particularly facilities handling classified information related to nuclear weapons, submarine technology, and other strategic military systems. The review identified significant weaknesses in security procedures that had allowed Houghton and G to remove classified materials without detection for years. Background checks were found to be insufficiently thorough and were not updated regularly enough to catch changes in personnel circumstances that might make them vulnerable to recruitment. Oversight of personnel with access to classified materials was found to be inadequate, with too much trust placed in initial security clearances and too little ongoing monitoring of activities and behaviors. The security review led to substantial reforms. Background check procedures were enhanced to include more thorough investigation of financial circumstances, foreign contacts, and behavioral indicators of potential vulnerability. Security clearances were made subject to periodic renewal and reinvestigation rather than being granted once and assumed valid indefinitely. Access to classified materials was more carefully controlled through document tracking systems that would make unauthorized removal more difficult and more likely to be detected. Security awareness training was enhanced to help employees recognize potential security threats and understand their responsibilities to report suspicious activities. The 2-person rule was implemented for access to the most sensitive materials, requiring that classified documents only be handled when 2 cleared personnel were both present. For the intelligence and security services, the Portland spy ring case became both a success story and a cautionary tale. It was cited in training programs as an example of patient, methodical counterintelligence work, from the initial tip from a defector through months of careful surveillance that identified all participants in the network to the carefully timed arrests that caught the operatives with evidence in their possession. But it was also studied as an example of security failures that had allowed the espionage to continue undetected for approximately 8 years before the defector's information prompted the investigation. The case revealed the extent of Soviet intelligence operations in Britain during the height of the Cold War. The Portland spy ring was not an isolated operation, but part of a systematic effort by Soviet intelligence to penetrate Western defense establishments, recruit assets with access to sensitive information, and steal military secrets. The use of illegal residents like the Cohens, deep-cover intelligence officers operating under false identities without diplomatic protection, demonstrated the sophistication and resources that Soviet intelligence was willing to commit to these long-term operations. For Gordon Lonsdale, whose real name was Conon Molody, the years in British prison were presumably difficult, though he never spoke publicly about his experiences and maintained his cover identity and his denials throughout his incarceration. In 1964, 3 years after his conviction, an opportunity arose for his release through a prisoner exchange. Greville Wynne, a British businessman who had been working with MI6 to pass information from Soviet GRU Colonel Oleg Penkovsky to Western intelligence, had been arrested in Budapest in November 1962, tried in Moscow alongside Penkovsky, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The British government, which valued Wynne's service and wished to secure his release, negotiated with Soviet authorities for an exchange. On April 22, 1964, Gordon Lonsdale was exchanged for Greville Wynne at the Heerstrasse checkpoint in West Berlin. Lonsdale had served 3 years of his 25-year sentence. He was driven across the checkpoint from British custody in West Berlin into East German territory, while Wynne was simultaneously transferred in the opposite direction. Lonsdale was taken to Moscow, where, according to Soviet sources, he was welcomed as a hero and awarded medals and honors for his intelligence work. He reportedly resumed work for the KGB, training other intelligence officers in the techniques of deep-cover operations and legend building. He died in Moscow in 1970, at the age of 48. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, though some Western intelligence sources speculated about possible poisoning, a fate that befell other Soviet intelligence officers who fell out of favor or were suspected of having been compromised. Peter and Helen Kroger remained in British prisons for 8 years. In 1969, they were exchanged for Gerald Brooke, a British lecturer who had been arrested in the Soviet Union in 1965 on charges of anti-Soviet activities and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Krogers had served 8 years of their 20-year sentences when they were released as part of this exchange. Following their release, they were taken first to Poland and then to Moscow, where they lived quietly for the remainder of their lives. Morris Cohen died in 1995 at the age of 84. Lona Cohen died in 1992 at the age of 79. Neither ever publicly discussed their espionage activities or acknowledged their true identities and roles, maintaining even in their later years the discipline and operational security expected of professional intelligence officers. Harry Houghton and Ethel G. served approximately 9 years of their 15-year sentences before being released on parole in 1970. Upon release, both attempted to resume normal lives, though they found that their espionage convictions had made them essentially unemployable in any position that required security clearance or trust. Houghton worked at various manual labor jobs and struggled financially for the remainder of his life. In 1985, 24 years after his conviction, Houghton published a memoir titled Operation Portland, the autobiography of a spy, in which he attempted to explain his motivations and justify his actions. The book portrayed him as someone who had been manipulated by sophisticated Soviet intelligence officers and who had not fully understood the significance of what he was doing, a characterization that reviewers and intelligence professionals found unconvincing given the evidence presented at his trial showing systematic espionage over nearly a decade. Houghton died later in 1985, shortly after the book's publication, at the age of 75. Ethel G., who had been portrayed during the trial and in subsequent accounts as someone who had been led into espionage by her infatuation with Houghton and who supposedly had not fully understood what she was involved in, lived quietly after her release from prison. She never spoke publicly about her case, never wrote a memoir, and declined all requests for interviews from journalists and researchers. She lived in modest circumstances in the West Country, working when she could find employment that would accept someone with an espionage conviction. According to people who knew her after her release, she lived a solitary life and appeared to carry substantial guilt about what she had done. She died in 1993. At the age of 78, having spent the last 23 years of her life trying to rebuild an existence that her involvement with Houghton and her participation in espionage had destroyed. The broader impact of the Portland spy ring case on British society and security culture was substantial. The trial had been extensively covered in British newspapers and had revealed not only the activities of 5 individuals, but the existence of a sophisticated Soviet espionage network operating on British soil, stealing military secrets over a period of years. The revelations contributed to public anxiety about Soviet penetration of Western institutions and reinforced Cold War tensions between East and West. The case occurred during a period when espionage scandals were eroding public confidence in British security. The Portland spy ring trial occurred less than a decade after the defection of British diplomats Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean to the Soviet Union in 1951. And would be followed by additional revelations about Soviet penetration of British intelligence, including the exposure of Kim Philby as a Soviet agent in 1963. The physical evidence recovered from 45 Cranley Drive, including the microdot reader from the talcum powder tin, became part of Britain's intelligence history. Some of these items were eventually displayed in museums documenting espionage and Cold War history, including the Science Museum in London and the International Spy Museum. The talcum powder tin itself, with its hidden compartment and its concealment of sophisticated espionage equipment in such an ordinary household object, became an iconic example of the techniques used by Cold War spies to hide their activities in plain sight. The Portland spy ring case raised questions that extended beyond the specific individuals involved or the specific information that had been compromised. It raised fundamental questions about trust and verification in security systems, about the psychological vulnerabilities that made individuals susceptible to recruitment by foreign intelligence services, about the tension between the need for openness in democratic societies and the requirement for secrecy in military and intelligence matters, and about how societies could protect necessary secrets without creating oppressive surveillance systems that undermined the freedoms they were meant to protect. One question that investigators and security professionals struggled with after the case was how an operation as significant as the Portland spy ring had been able to function for approximately 8 years without being detected through internal security measures. Harry Houghton had been removing classified documents from the underwater detection establishment systematically during this entire period. He had handled hundreds of classified documents, photographed them, and passed the information to Soviet intelligence through Lonsdale. How had no one at the facility noticed? How had the security systems failed so comprehensively for so long? Part of the answer lay in the limitations of 1950s security practices, which relied heavily on initial background checks but provided very limited ongoing monitoring of cleared personnel. Once someone received a security clearance after their initial background investigation, they were essentially trusted until some specific reason emerged to question that trust. There were no regular audits of who accessed what documents, no systematic monitoring of unusual patterns in document handling, and no requirement for periodic reinvestigation of cleared personnel to determine if their circumstances had changed in ways that might make them vulnerable to recruitment or compromise. Part of the answer also lay in the social dynamics of workplaces, where colleagues were often reluctant to report suspicions about each other. After the trial, several of Houghton's co-workers acknowledged in interviews that they had noticed unusual behavior over the years. Houghton accessing files he did not need for his work, spending time examining documents that were not relevant to his assigned duties, appearing to have more money than his civil service salary would explain through his new car and expensive habits. But they had not reported these observations because they did not want to cause trouble for a colleague, they were not certain their suspicions were justified, or they did not believe anything would be done, even if they did report concerns. This reluctance to report suspicious behavior was a significant vulnerability in security systems that relied on human judgment and human reporting. The case highlighted the fundamental challenge of protecting secrets in organizations where thousands of people needed access to classified information to perform their jobs. The underwater detection establishment employed hundreds of people who had legitimate need to access sensitive technical information about submarine detection systems and naval technologies. The vast majority of these people were trustworthy and took their security responsibilities seriously. But in any large organization, statistical probability suggested there would inevitably be some individuals who could be compromised through ideological sympathy with adversaries, through financial pressure that made money payments attractive, through personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited, or through manipulation by skilled intelligence officers. Security systems needed to identify these vulnerable or compromised individuals before they could cause significant damage, but accomplishing this without creating an atmosphere of paranoia and pervasive distrust was extraordinarily difficult. For the Soviet intelligence services, the Portland spy ring represented a significant operational success for nearly a decade, followed by a significant operational failure when the network was exposed and dismantled. The information obtained from Houghton and G had provided Soviet military planners and submarine designers with detailed understanding of British anti-submarine warfare capabilities, which could inform the development of countermeasures and potentially neutralize Britain's technological advantages. The loss of this valuable source of information, along with the exposure and imprisonment of 3 professional intelligence officers, including an illegal resident and a support team, represented a serious setback to Soviet intelligence operations in Britain. The fact that all 3 professional intelligence officers, Lonsdale and the Krogers, were eventually exchanged for Western prisoners and returned to the Soviet Union reflected the KGB's commitment to protecting its operatives even after they had been caught and imprisoned. This commitment to not abandoning captured officers sent an important message to current and future intelligence personnel that the KGB would make efforts to secure their release even if operations went wrong and they were caught. This commitment helped maintain morale and loyalty within the intelligence service. For Britain's intelligence and security services, the Portland spy ring case was studied for decades as both a success and a failure. It was a failure in that the espionage operation had been able to function for approximately 8 years before being detected, during which time significant classified information about submarine technology had been compromised. The operation had not been discovered through Britain's own internal security measures, but only after a Polish defector provided information that prompted the investigation. This raised uncomfortable questions about how many other espionage operations might be functioning undetected. But the case was also studied as a success in counterintelligence methodology. Once the initial information from the defector prompted the investigation, MMI-5 had conducted a patient, methodical operation that documented the network's activities, identified all the key participants, and gathered the evidence needed for successful prosecution. Rather than moving immediately to arrest Harry Houghton when he was first identified as a suspect, MY5 had conducted months of surveillance to understand the full extent of the network. This patient approach had allowed them to identify Lonsdale as the case officer and the Krogers as the communications support team, rolling up the entire network rather than arresting one individual while others remained unknown and at large. The case demonstrated the value of allowing espionage operations to continue under surveillance for a period of time in order to map the full network before making arrests. It also demonstrated the importance of timing arrests to maximize evidence collection, catching Houghton and Lonsdale during an actual exchange with classified documents in Lonsdale's possession, then immediately moving on the Kroger residence before they could be warned and destroy evidence. The talcum powder tin, with its hidden compartment, remained in many ways the perfect symbol for the entire case. It represented the ordinariness that often concealed espionage during the Cold War, the fact that spycraft was not exotic or glamorous, but consisted of prosaic objects and ordinary-seeming people engaged in activities that looked completely innocent until examined with suspicion and careful attention to detail. The tin sat on a bathroom shelf in a middle-class bungalow in suburban London, in a neighborhood where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and children played in gardens, appearing to be exactly what it claimed to be, a container of talcum powder for daily use. Only when weighed carefully, when shaken and listened to attentively, when opened and examined methodically, did it reveal its true nature as an espionage tool designed to hide equipment for reading microdots containing photographed secrets? The microdots themselves represented another crucial aspect of the case's significance: the technological sophistication of Cold War espionage. A microdot was a photograph of a document reduced to approximately 1 millimeter in diameter, roughly the size of a typewritten period. These tiny photographs could be hidden in ordinary letters, concealed in objects, or placed on seemingly innocent documents, and they were nearly impossible to detect without specialized equipment and knowledge of what to look for. A single microdot could contain an entire page of text, a technical diagram, or detailed specifications. The microdot reader found in the talcum powder tin was the key technology that made these hidden messages readable, transforming a tiny speck invisible to casual examination into legible text and diagrams. The Portland spy ring case occurred at a particular moment in Cold War history, the late 1950s and early 1960s, when tensions between East and West were acute, when both sides were engaged in intensive espionage operations against each other, and when the stakes seemed existential. Britain was developing nuclear weapons and nuclear-powered submarines, technologies that represented the cutting edge of military capability and strategic deterrence. Soviet intelligence was systematically attempting to steal information about these programs to match or counter Western capabilities and to understand Western military planning. The espionage was not occurring in some abstract geopolitical space, but in specific, concrete locations. The underwater detection establishment in Portland, where Houghton and G worked, the bungalow in Ruislip, where the Krogers lived and operated their communications center, the street corners near Waterloo Station, where Houghton and Lonsdale conducted their monthly meetings, involving real people making real choices with real consequences that would shape their lives and affect their nation's security. Harry Houghton was approximately 42 years old when he was first recruited by Soviet intelligence in the early 1950s. He was 50 when he was arrested in January 1961. He was 59 when he was released from prison in 1970. He was 75 when he died in 1985, having spent the last 33 years of his life, nearly half his entire lifetime, either actively committing espionage, serving time in prison for espionage, or living with the consequences of his espionage conviction. His decisions to accept Soviet recruitment, to steal classified documents systematically over years, to betray his country and his oath for money, whatever combination of financial pressure, moral weakness, ideological sympathy, or simple greed had motivated those initial choices, had determined the entire course of the rest of his life, and had caused harm that extended far beyond himself to Britain's national security. Ethel G. was 43 years old when she began helping Houghton obtain classified materials in 1958. She was 46 when she was arrested. She was 55 when she was released from prison. She was 78 when she died in 1993, having spent 35 years living with the consequences of a decision she appeared to have made primarily because she was in love with someone who exploited her willingness to help him. Her case illustrated one of the recurring patterns in espionage history: how personal relationships, emotional vulnerabilities, loneliness, and the desire to please someone could be exploited to recruit assets who might not have been susceptible to ideological appeals or direct financial inducements. G's tragedy was that she destroyed her life and betrayed her country for someone who appeared to have valued her primarily for her access to classified information. The Cohens, Morris and Lona, operating in Britain under their false identities as Peter and Helen Kroger, were professional intelligence officers who had chosen espionage as a career and who had committed their entire adult lives to serving Soviet intelligence. They were 51 and 49 years old, respectively, when they were arrested in 1961. They served 8 years in harsh conditions in British prisons before being exchanged. They lived for another 23 to 26 years in Moscow following their release, reportedly honored by Soviet authorities for their decades of service, but forever separated from the United States, where they had been born and raised, and from the identities they had assumed in Britain. Whether they experienced regret, satisfaction, or simply acceptance of the lives they had chosen is unknowable. They never spoke publicly about their experiences and maintained operational security and cover discipline to the end of their lives, dying with their secrets. Gordon Lonsdale, whose real name was Conan Molody, was 37 years old when he was arrested in 1961, having spent approximately 6 years running the Portland spy ring as the case officer managing Houghton and coordinating with the Krogers. He served 3 years in British prison before being exchanged. He lived for only another 6 years after his return to Moscow, dying at age 48 under circumstances that remain unclear. His life illustrated the risks that illegal residents accepted when they agreed to serve their intelligence services, operating under deep cover in hostile territory without diplomatic protection, knowing that discovery would mean lengthy imprisonment, maintaining false identities for years at a time, and ultimately being used by intelligence organizations that valued their operational contributions but might or might not protect them adequately when operations went wrong, or when they were no longer useful. The question that remained decades after the Portland spy ring case was what it meant and what lessons could be drawn from it beyond the immediate consequences for the individuals involved. At one level, the case was straightforward. Individuals had committed espionage against Britain. They had been caught through effective counterintelligence work. They had been prosecuted in a fair trial with overwhelming evidence, and they had been imprisoned. Justice had been served. The security weaknesses that had allowed the operation to function undetected for years had been identified and corrected through reforms. The network had been completely dismantled. But at another level, the case raised questions that had no simple or complete answers. What created the conditions in which espionage became possible and in which ordinary people could be recruited to betray their countries? How could democratic societies protect necessary military and intelligence secrets while maintaining the openness and trust that were essential to democratic governance? How could security systems identify genuine threats without creating paranoid surveillance states? What were the appropriate balances between individual privacy and collective security, between trust and verification, between the rights of employees and the requirements of national defense? The Portland spy ring operated during a period when East and West were locked in ideological competition and military confrontation, when both sides believed the stakes justified extraordinary measures, including extensive espionage operations. The individuals involved, Houghton, Lonsdale, the Cohens, were all acting within a context shaped by Cold War tensions, intelligence agency priorities, and geopolitical calculations that they did not control and perhaps did not fully understand. They made individual choices, but those choices occurred within systems that created opportunities, incentives, and rationalizations for espionage. The case illustrated the human dimensions of intelligence operations, the fact that espionage was not an abstract game played between intelligence services, but consisted of activities involving real people making real choices with real consequences that rippled outward to affect many others. It illustrated the ways that ideology, money, love, manipulation, duty, betrayal, and loyalty all interacted in complex ways in the decisions that people made about whether to spy, whether to report suspicions about colleagues, whether to investigate thoroughly, whether to prosecute vigorously, whether to exchange prisoners. It illustrated the impossibility of perfect security in any system involving human beings. No matter how thorough background checks became, no matter how sophisticated security systems were, there would always be some individuals who could be compromised, always some vulnerabilities that could be exploited, always some information that could leak through determined espionage efforts. The challenge for security professionals was to minimize these risks to acceptable levels while accepting that they could never be entirely eliminated without creating security measures so restrictive that they would prevent legitimate work from being accomplished. The talcum powder tin sits in a museum display case now, a small artifact of espionage history from more than 6 decades ago. Visitors can look at it, read the explanatory placard describing what it was used for and what was found inside it, and perhaps understand intellectually that this ordinary-looking household object had been modified to contain tools used in a major espionage operation. But the tin by itself cannot convey the full story. The 8 years of systematic espionage that preceded its discovery, the patient investigation that led to its exposure, the dramatic arrests and the lengthy trial that followed, the prison sentences served by 5 people, the lives disrupted and destroyed, the classified information about submarine technology that was compromised, the security reforms that were implemented, the lessons learned or sometimes not learned, and the moral complexities that defy simple judgments even decades later. Harry Houghton was approximately 42 when he chose to become a spy in exchange for money. He was 75 when he died, still trying to explain and justify choices he had made more than 3 decades earlier in a memoir that convinced few readers. And in between those years, he had lost his freedom for 9 years, his reputation permanently, his future prospects, and perhaps his own understanding of who he was or what his life had meant. Whether he believed at the end that the money had been worth the price, whether he felt genuine remorse for the harm he had caused to Britain's security, whether he understood the larger significance of what he had done beyond its impact on his own life. These questions have no documented answers. What is certain is that a single decision to accept Soviet recruitment had determined the entire course of the rest of his life, and that the consequences had extended far beyond what he likely anticipated when he first agreed to provide information for payment. The Portland spy ring was exposed because a defector on the other side of Europe had information and chose to share it with Western intelligence, because investigators followed leads methodically and patiently over many months, because searchers examined ordinary household objects carefully enough to find hidden compartments and false bottoms, and because prosecutors built cases on overwhelming evidence rather than on speculation or assumption. But it had been able to function successfully for approximately 8 years because people at the underwater detection establishment did not notice suspicious behavior or did not report what they noticed, because security systems had significant weaknesses and gaps, because professional spies looked and behaved like ordinary middle-class people living ordinary suburban lives, and because the mundane ordinariness of a talcum powder tin sitting on a bathroom shelf in a bungalow in Ruislip was the perfect concealment for sophisticated tools of espionage hidden in plain sight.